Welcome to the latest What If Wednesday, the day before American Independence Day. My name's David Munger, and I'm one of Peter's colleagues in the history department, and I'm here essentially, I think, thank you, Peter, to make you like Americans a bit more by comparison with the snooty Englishman. And it won't be the first time I've achieved that. So, I mean, Peter is talking today about what if the United States had not declared independence from Britain. And obviously we know that every year there are pictures of Americans celebrating and bonfires and fireworks and all sorts of excitement. But of course we all know, in Britain at least, that what that's masking is the trauma of all the Americans going home and holding their heads and thinking, what were we thinking? I mean, just imagine a world without an independent America. Instead of Starbucks, coffee shops in every corner, you'd have Lions tea shops in every corner. Wouldn't that be nice? Instead of angry conversations about politics, we'd have fascinating conversations about the weather. Instead of sports that involve a large amount of body armor and go on for several years, apparently, you'd have rugby. Cricket as well, that goes on for a few years, but that's different armor, and that's dignified. And it's the dignity, I think, that is the big loss for America from having left the mother country. They haven't quite grasped the language, despite 200 years to try and develop their own. They don't realize that a biscuit is a small, sweet, round baked thing that's dunked in tea, not a large baked thing that's dunked in gravy. And that's a real problem, I think, for Americans, that they're struggling to recover from. But, maybe I should stop making fun of Americans now, he is my boss. There are some real things to ponder. If, for instance, America had not declared independence from Britain, would they have freed their slaves earlier? In line with the British, would they have seen the light slightly sooner? Maybe, maybe not. If Americans had been part of the British Empire still at the turn of the 20th century, would we have had 2 world wars? Or would it have been too powerful presence for Germany or other powers to consider it worthwhile? And these, perhaps, are some of the things that Peter might consider talking about. And that's enough from me, anyway, from a warm-up. Is Professor Peter Field, Head of Department of History, Associate Head of School of Humanities, General Hard Worker. Over to you.
Well done, I'll get even. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much, David Monger. I've always found that the longer the introduction someone wants, the worse their speech generally is. Isn't that right? So the poor, insecure people who always come to the history department here and give you a laundry list of their publications to prove how much they know. Well, in this case, we'll do just the opposite. You can decide after you've eaten the pudding whether it's worth it or not. The pudding being me today, and I'm deeply delighted and flattered that you've come out to hear us. All right, so What If Wednesday. Today we have our What if America had not declared itself independent. And while I probably won't be talking about sport or culinary peculiarities of the Americans, I hope you'll indulge me in talking about a few things social, political, and historical. But before I begin, we might start anyway with the 23rd of December, 1773, because on that date, of course, the Americans, a birthing, do tell the British a little bit about what they know of tea. And while it's true that Americans on the whole don't drink much tea, and because the world is made America instead of British, we drink much more Coke and coffee than we do this other thing called tea, nevertheless, Americans reminded the British on this particular day that they knew quite a lot about tea and what to do with it. And on this particular day, dressed as Mohawk Indians, or so they say, maybe it really was Mohawk Indians, or Amerindians as we call them now, they went down to Boston Harbor and got onto the 3 ships that had come into harbor with East India tea, now to be sold by the West India Tea Company as a monopoly, and threw it in Boston Harbor. In fact, they decided that the way to make a party was to have tea. They found the tea, they found the water in the harbor, and as long as you have Indians entertaining them, all would go well. And as you'll note, this is in many ways the beginning of the American Revolution. After all, the Prime Minister, Lord North, speaking in Parliament, says, whatever may be the consequences, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over for the empire. So the Americans do indeed find themselves declaring independence. I'm going to talk a little bit today about what that means. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why the Americans were obliged, at least they felt, to challenge the tea monopoly, and more importantly, to challenge the imperial rule of the British Empire, or the first British Empire, excuse me. And then we'll talk, as we go through this, in terms of what should we call some slight meta-historical questions. Will that put you to sleep straight away, right? That is, we'll talk a little bit about theory of history and counterfactuals and things like that. Hopefully with not too much seriousness, and certainly no exam at the end. Anyway, this is not a good way to deliver a lecture. We now know among us learners, that's what you are, right? The worst thing we can do is have a classroom like this where you sit and take notes or don't take notes, and I lecture. After all, it's not about what I know, it's about what you learn. The second big mistake we make, now that we've learned this over lots of years of pedagogy, is to not start by telling you things we know, but by finding out what you already know so that then you can engage in learning. So we are undermining what we do at the university every Wednesday with our What If Wednesday lectures. Thank you for that, right? And so in order not to do that, let me see if I can throw out a few soft pitches or whatever, very small pitches, to see where we all are. So if America had not declared itself independent, when? What are we talking about? Do you all know? Well, you probably do, but let's make sure. Let's cover a few things. The first is a birthday. That is, when America declared itself independent, is the 4th of July of 1776, right? So we're looking in the latter part of the 18th century, in the period we call the Enlightenment. I'm going to come back to this and talk until I'm blue in the face about what the Enlightenment is in a little while. And this great birthday, the 4th of July, we celebrate every year. So come a few hours from now, Americans will celebrate their birthday for the 237th time. What's in a birthday? Well, actually, that's an interesting enough question to ask. Why? Well, where's New Zealand's birthday? What day is it? Is it the 6th of February, 1840? Is that it? It's an interesting question to decide on a birthday. Americans don't have this problem. They know it's the 4th of July every year. What else should we talk about? Well, without the American Revolution, we would not be talking about or declaring independence. We would not have a declaration of independence. And we'll spend a little bit of time today covering what I trust you already know, right? That is, on the 4th of July, 1776, Americans celebrate a birthday, not because that's the first battle of the war, not because that's when they win their revolutionary independence. That won't come until 1783, 1781 with the Battle of Yorktown maybe. But on this date, the Americans promulgate their Declaration of Independence. And if Americans hadn't had independence, we would never have had this particular document and the ideals which are embodied in it. So we'll cover some of that. Thirdly, well, Americans have a history, right? So 1776 is America, or the United States of America's birthday. These 13 colonies, now states, united, declare their independence. But they've been around for a while. In fact, that's probably the key to understanding independence. We'll cover that in the next What If lecture sometime in the future. But for now, at least note that the first permanent American settlement was Jamestown in the state we call Virginia, right? Named after the Virgin Queen, right? And that was founded at the very beginning of the 17th century. So what are we saying? We're saying the land that Thomas Jefferson, who helped to write the Declaration of Independence, comes from, Virginia, had been around for about 150 plus years before America has its birthday. All right, what else? What else do we have here? What else do I think you already probably know, right? My guess is you know that Americans get their independence not by a declaration, not by their so-called ideals, but by a war. That is, from April of 1775 through the Battle of Yorktown in October of 1781, the Americans are at war with the British Empire. We win, right? I'll get to that in just a moment, right? But it is certainly not a certainty. In fact, I would say exactly the opposite. I would say that the majority, even a supermajority of colonists either were outright against this war. We call them Tories or loyalists. Some would call them traitors, but I think that's probably the wrong thing to say in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2013. But another whole group were convinced it wouldn't work, and therefore were straddling the fence or something like that. So I would say barely a third actually were for independence and would think of fighting for it. It was indeed a revolutionary experience, this war. But you know that, right? You know that already. It was a war. The king of England at the time, the monarch, was the third Hanoverian king, King George III. He had taken over from, take a guess, I bet you know this one, George II, right? In 1760. So this wasn't entirely the imperial crisis his making, but he'd been around long enough that we could certainly blame him for what goes wrong. He certainly, I think, felt that he should take the blame. He refused to have anyone speak United States of America in his presence for a decade after the war. So maybe for him, America actually hadn't declared and won its independence. So George III, the Hanoverian king. Obviously, the Hanovers and the colonists didn't get along very well. In fact, this is probably one of the elements in the crisis, too, the problems of British leadership. Not so for the Americans. Again, something I trust you already know. That is, the Americans have many leaders. You've probably heard of Samuel Adams and John Hancock and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Perhaps the great indispensable man, though, is George Washington, right? George Washington becomes the one great military mind, certainly not a military genius, but an able military organizer. He is the head of the Continental Army. He is the only head of the Continental Army, Lieutenant General, and he helps lead these would-be revolutionaries to their independence, right? So we'll talk a little bit about George. And finally, of course, I trust, although we live in New Zealand, that you do know that the Americans won, right? When we come to question and answer time, David and I will do repertoire, I'm sure. Repartee, I'm sorry. That's part of our repertoire. All right, so there we are. So we know where we are. So now I want to introduce some world history and actually look at the question of a counterfactual. If then, let's have a look at this before we get into the details of the American Revolution. And I think we want to start by saying, if the Americans hadn't declared themselves independent, what? Well, if they hadn't, we already have an answer. It's called Canada, right? The Canadians do not declare themselves independent, right? They are part of the Dominion. They remain within it for a very, very long time. They still have their connection. They still have kings and queens on their currency. So the first thing we might say is, well, the easy answer to this question, I'm not sure why you came along. Well, you're a friend, so I know why you came along. You had to, right? But I'm not sure why you came along because the answer is one word, Canada. And it is an interesting kind of answer, in part because the First Empire offered the Canadians a very interesting kind of settlement or relationship after Canada, French Canada, had been essentially conquered. Oh, that's right, the British do conquer, right? Right? That's why we hire an imperial historian when we do the history of Britain, where with the Americans, I'm just an Americanist, right? In any event, they offer good terms to this part of the Dominion after the French and Indian, the 7 Years' War. And so in 1763, the Canadians get such good terms that I'm willing to suggest here straight away, I'm a long way from America too, and the ambassador isn't here till tomorrow, right? So don't tell Hebner, right? That, right, as you go, right, he's listening in. Well, no, Snowden's actually going to put it on WikiLeaks tomorrow, right? I should be very careful about this. That if the Americans, the American colonies had been offered these kinds of terms in the 1760s and 1770s, then likely we would not be looking at this counterfactual because it wouldn't have happened. What's more, the Canadians in funny ways define themselves as not America. So they'd also have a problem if they were united, right, as one dominion, right? What would they think of themselves as? They'd have to be like the Yanks, and that would be terrible, right, for them. And it's really true. In many ways, they are the not Americans, right? Do we have a Canadian in the audience? I know we have at least one or two. Hi, right, how are you? From Alberta, right? So you're decidedly not American, right? How often do you say that while you're in Christchurch? Daily? Too often. Okay, right. So there we go. It's called Canada. But the funny thing is, even though the Canadians define themselves as not American, it is the longest unarmed, unmanned border in the world, right? So it is porous. It had been much more porous before 9/11. And so in many ways, the Canadians and the Americans are exceedingly similar. Nothing like, say, the Australians and the New Zealanders. Well, if there had been, or if the Americans had not declared their independence, had remained part of the Dominion, like Canada, then we might say, well, the great event, the great story of the unfolding of ideals of modernity, of the Enlightenment, would be the French Revolution, right? Liberté, égalité, fraternité, right? We would all be singing the Marseillaise. This would be July 14th, the big holiday, and perhaps even today, right, we would all be children of Akaroa and be talking en français, right? It's entirely possible, right? Or is it? Actually, though, if one really thinks closely about the French Revolution, it's hard to say that the French Revolution would have been the great event of the enlightened 18th century. Why is that? Because it's hard to imagine a French Revolution if there hadn't been Americans declaring their independence in 1776. Because without this, without the imperial crisis, without the French signing 4 treaties, including a treaty of alliance with those would-be American revolutionaries during the war in 1778, well then, without a fiscal crisis, it's entirely likely that Louis would not have called the Estates General. He wouldn't have been broke. Without the Estates General, maybe there would have been no crisis, no economic crisis, no political crisis, no French Revolution. I'm not saying that's sure, but I am suggesting that when we look at counterfactuals, we do run into lots of troubles as soon as we ask ourselves, what if? Or, better yet, lots of interesting questions. I'll come back to this. All right, we should move on. Shall I move over here to this side now? One of the terrible things about this is if you don't use notes, you constantly find the light getting in your eyes as you go back and forth. I'll not worry about that. Yes, the great question that David actually offered you at the beginning, I think, is one of the most interesting. There is no discussion of American history, right, Rafi, without a discussion of slavery. The Americans have slavery from those first days, virtually not 1607, but 1620, 1619, right through the American Civil War. Slavery really only ends in 1865. So more than half of America's history is the history of inequality, the history of individuals owning other individuals as property, slavery. What about this issue? And here we come up to a very interesting fact. In the history of the Western Hemisphere, almost every single part of the settlement, from Columbus on, from 1492, for 400 years, there's slavery. There's Spanish slavery, there's Portuguese slavery, there's English, there's French, there's Dutch, there's American. The first, after Toussaint Louverture and the revolution in Haiti, is the British emancipation. The first emancipation of the British, they come first, and in 1833, they pass emancipation, and emancipation in the West Indies begins in 1834. With a 10-year apprenticeship, by the way. It's not that slaves are instantly freed, as they are in America, by the way, after the 13th Amendment. The American Emancipation Project, again, another class, another What If Wednesday, is the most radical in the West, but we won't talk about that. The British plan was gradual. And of course, this wasn't ending slavery in Liverpool or in London or Bristol. I can't name too many more English cities. I've not been there. But it was the ending of slavery in Barbados, Jamaica, right, in Paradise Island and other places in the West Indies. But if there had been no American Declaration of Independence, then we wouldn't have been talking about Barbados and Jamaica and Plantation Islands, right, Bermuda. We'd have to be talking about Georgia and South Carolina and Louisiana and Virginia. Did I leave out North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, Texas, right? There'd be all of these other colonies in the Dominion with slavery. 500,000 slaves in the 1820s in the American Southern colonies alone, or American Southern states, excuse me. So what do we say about this? Would, in fact, being part of the British Empire have meant no American Civil War because slavery would have been over between 1833 and 1843? Would 1844 have been that great moment of celebration, of liberation? I doubt it. Rather, I think of the Lancashire Mills. I think of the British, our great friends during the American Civil War, waiting in 1861, waiting in 1862, saying maybe we should recognize the Confederacy. After all, a split America is an interesting idea. We'll come back to that in this class, or sorry, I apologize for that, in our discussion with each other, right? And that waiting and that thinking about, well, maybe the American Union isn't the group. Maybe we want to align ourselves with, or at least recognize the Confederacy, the source of much of our cotton for our mills, makes me pause and think that more likely the Americans would have found themselves, good British subjects, pushing toward Parliament, pushing into Parliament, and inhibiting the first British emancipation of slaves in 1832 and 1833. That's my look at it. Then again, think about it this way. Without leaving the Dominion, it's very clear to me, I'll go very quickly over this, that the Americans wouldn't have expanded west so fast. And without fast westward expansion, the American Northeast, that's where I'm from, would have industrialized much more quickly, and with much quicker industrialization, it's entirely likely then that there would have been some fundamental conflict between colonial American North and colonial American South. So again, a very interesting what if. Don't expect me to try and resolve it in any way. All right. Certainly, though, I at least want to last mention that if there had been no conflict, then the Americans would not have had a civil war. And if you are an American, and you know your history, and you know that there were 600,000 Americans that died between 1861 and 1865, almost anything that would have meant no war is a very promising what if to explore. Especially today, which is the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, where 51,100 Americans died. So that's what they're celebrating actually today. Anyway, now we move on to something closer to my colleague's heart. Well, what about World War I? Well, it seems likely that if there had been a very strong dominion between Canada and America tied to Britain, then Britain would have been far stronger. And the military might, right, the armor and arms and munitions that the Americans very belatedly, yes, we get reminded of this often in New Zealand, very belatedly bring to the battle by the summer of 1917 would have been there and ready in August, September, October 1914, January 1915. And this might have inhibited the Germans from invading France and Belgium. So maybe there would have been no World War I. No World War I, no Hitler, no November criminals, no stab in the back, no World War II. Maybe. Well, of course, too, if there's no American Revolution, the Americans hadn't declared their independence, well, maybe there'd be no United States, and maybe, therefore, there'd be no... Well, we'll leave that one alone. I've just put that up there. Nobody's laughing, so it didn't go over. But I realized when I put this up there this afternoon that you might not laugh because you would assume that if you're a lecturer in a university, you must be very far to the left politically, right? What's that? That's right, no Cold War. Yeah. So no military-industrial complex. But that's not what I meant. What I meant was, of course, America is such a bad nation in the world, right, that if there had been no American independence, or if the South, actually, the Confederate States of America had won the Civil War and split the United States in half, then you wouldn't have this juggernaut for capitalist, globalist, techno-fascist intervention. Anyway. But that was meant to be something of a joke. All right, quickly, I want to get to some history. And I just want to give you at least a flavor of what historians do with counterfactuals, because they do many good things with them. And one of my favorite comes from a man named Lawrence Henry Gibson, actually an Englishman. And this Englishman studied 18th century colonial development, and he had a wonderful article that was explicitly around a what if. He said, what if there had been no French and Indian War? You don't really know this war much, but it was really the First World War. In many ways, it's the first great war in world history, or at least Western world history. It lasts for 7 years, 9 years for the Americans, actually. They start in 1754. He said, what if there had been no war? And his answer was, if there hadn't been a war, which we win, by the way, right? The British and the colonials defeat the French. We win this war. He says, even though we win it, the key thing is, for the British, winning means losing. Because if they hadn't won, there'd still be the French in Canada. And if the French are in Canada and the Spanish are in Florida, the North and the South in North America, then the colonists would have had to reconsider declaring independence. Why? Because the great benefit of the empire is vis-a-vis other empires. So in a world of empires, you can't think about independence. But once you've defeated the French, and by the way, the Spanish have been defeated in the War of Jenkins' Ear. There's a great ear in history, right? Van Gogh sends his ear to his girlfriend. I don't recommend that as a way to win over girlfriends on the whole. Right? We have the War for Jenkins' Ear. So in the War for Jenkins' Ear ends in 1739. The Americans the British, North Americans clear out the Spanish. They're not a problem. And after the French and Indian War, the French aren't an issue in Canada. So now the colonists, ingrates that they are, right, can think, well, now maybe we don't need an empire. We can declare independence. Anyway, one of the most interesting counterfactuals in the way you can use counterfactuals in history, written by a man named Lawrence Henry Gibson in the 1960s. All right, so what do we want to talk about a little bit? Well, if we're not going to find much other to say about what if it hadn't happened, let's have a look at this Englishman who leaves England and moves to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the colony, in the end of 1774. November 1774, he shows up from London in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He looks around him and says, well, not what if, but inevitable. And in a pamphlet called Common Sense, there it is, which he publishes in January of 1776. So, right, just 14 months after he's been in the colonies, he looks around and tells the colonists, it is inevitable. Whether you declare it, whether you have a revolution, whether you fight it or not, you will be independent. So not what if, but inevitable. And he says in this document that the sun never shone on a greater cause, right? 'Tis not the affair of a city, a county, a province, or a kingdom, right? But of a continent, of at least 1/8 the part of the habitable globe. Gosh, we like it when the English get it right. And then he goes on a little bit later, a few paragraphs, says, but isn't there something absurd, or there is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island? In no instant hath nature, and nature is one of the themes we'll come back to in just a moment, made the satellite larger than its primary planet. And as England and America, with respect to each other, reverses the common order of nature. So it is written in history, it is written better yet, in nature, that the British North America will become independent, that we will have Americans. Tom Paine's Common Sense. Well, what this leads us to, of course, is, inevitable or not, in history, we always talk about individuals, biography. We talk about voluntarism. We talk about the fact that whether something's inevitable, whether it's in the hourglass, whether it's in time, it has to happen, right? Where you can't even say, what if it didn't happen? Someone has to do something. And in the American colonies, these folks, they look pretty good, right? These folks decide to do something. They decide that they won't wait. That even if time is on their side, they're going to act now. And they become the revolutionaries, the founders. In fact, the founding generation is so popular, so prominent in America, that it's actually not uncommon to ask, what would the founders have done, right? And I've tried to think, how is this analogous in any way to New Zealand? Right? You don't have a revolution, we have a revolution. You don't have founders. Exactly. Right? And very rarely do we say, what would, now I'm going to have trouble here. What was one of the guys first to design Canterbury? Wakefield, yeah. What would Wakefield, I like that, WWWD. What would Wakefield have done, right? We never hear that. The closest I can think of is what, though? What do you think? I think the closest I can think of in some way is what? The Anzac generation. I think there is some talk of that. What would they have done? What would they think? They were our best group. What would they do with these problems, right? I think that's the closest we get. Certainly in America, no Declaration of Independence, no generation that Americans repeatedly look to and say, what would the founders have done? Now, interestingly enough, in American constitutional history, in our look at positive law and natural law, in law schools, in law courts, in political theory, we often can actually answer at times WW founders, right? What would the founders have done? Because they wrote, right? They wrote down what they thought. They wrote it in Federalists. They wrote it in the Declaration of Independence. They wrote it in the Constitution of the United States. So indeed, one of the more interesting elements of American history and American jurisprudence history is the notion of, I guess, what we would call originalism or constitutional originalism. That is, the Constitution is explicit. It sets out in English what to do, and one doesn't need to translate or interpret. Well, of course, that's silly, but that is certainly what some argue about originalism, that one doesn't need to interpret or translate. They told us what was right. They told us what was best. We need not interpret or go beyond that. America's founders. Well, of course, the most famous words were penned, in part at least, by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration. And so if Americans hadn't declared their independence, we'd have no ideal document in the United States or in the world that is the equivalent of the American Declaration of Independence. What is it? What does it embody? What does it say? Well, let's have a look at that in our time remaining, largely. And of course, you know these lines, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Do you know these by heart? No? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are... No, you don't have to do that? No? Do you have to memorize Rudyard Kipling or something like that, right? Or Tennyson, right? Onward into the valley they went. Anyway, I'm not sure. But okay, fair enough. I can't quote that. Anyway, the Americans have their secular relics. They have their secular religion in some way, their civic religion, and the founding document, right? The urtext is the Declaration of Independence. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So, what is behind the Declaration? What do we have here? And what I want to suggest to you in many ways is that the Americans are profoundly affected by their revolution and declaring independence. It comes in three stages. It comes in a stage of, I guess, long-term development. It comes in a colonial challenge to English rules and laws with Stamp Acts and Molasses Acts and Intolerable Acts and all these crises in the 1760s and 1770s, and it comes finally in revolution. Behind all that, embodying that, is a generation that believes it better than any other, maybe the first ever, creates and devotes itself to science of humans, to a science of human nature, to a science of politics. So what I think is behind the Declaration of Independence is science. Now, not exactly F equals ma, right? I think that's Newton's second law or something like that. It's not quite that, but it is related because, of course, the heroes of the Enlightenment in many ways were the scientists, were Galileo and Newton, right? Galileo's great line that mathematics is the language which God has written the universe, right? It's God's second revelation. I believe the first is the Apostles' Creed or Jesus, right? But the second one is written in mathematics, right? So you understand science, you get closer to God. Similarly, of course, Alexander Pope, who's going to make light of this, reminds us of how just important Newton was. Newton was the great hero, all of our heroes wrapped up in one in many ways for the Enlightenment, right? Nature and nature's law lay hid at night. God said, let Newton be, right? And all was light, right? So this idea of science and the mechanical ways of the universe that one could understand it, and as one looked at it rationally, right? It looked back with reason. Was profoundly important for the Enlightenment, and the Americans declare their independence in the Enlightenment. So what does this mean? Well, I want to suggest it means several things. First of all, in relation to ethics, right? That is, what should you do? Thou shalt not, thou shalt. And the Americans take to heart, though they don't write about it, a European lives in London and writes something called Fable of the Bees. He's actually Dutch, but he lives in London and writes something called the Fable of the Bees. And the core of this is a poem called The Grumbling Hive. And in The Grumbling Hive, Bernard Manville tells us that we've got our ethics all wrong. It's not scientific enough. And a scientific study of man will tell us that our ethics should be consequentialist. Right? This sounds difficult. It's really very simple. This is what we call private vice, but public virtue. And so, of course, in a wonderful poem, can you read this as we go along, right? He tries to suggest that if you look for idealism, if you look for perfection, if you want God's rule on earth, you are utopian. You are making a huge mistake, right? Then leave complaints. Fools only strive to make a great and honest hive. Right? So he's advocating dishonesty. To enjoy the world's conveniences, be famed in war, yet live in ease, without great vices, is a vain utopia seated in the brain. Fraud, luxury, and pride must live whilst the benefits receive. Hunger's a dreadful plague, no doubt. Yet who digests or thrives without? Do we not owe the growth of wine to the dry, crooked, shabby vine? Right? So what is he telling us? What are humans? We are dry, crooked, shabby vines. But that is the only way to make wine. So what great American creed. The Americans don't write this. He lives in London. He's born in Rotterdam, I think, or something like that. But the Americans embody this and take it to heart. When we come back to the Declaration and we end with the look of pursuit of happiness, that's what they're referring to, right? That is moral consequentialism. That is, you do something selfish, you try to get ahead, you do things that are maybe questionable privately, but that striving, that looking to get ahead will benefit everyone. The second point to make would be about something called economy, or the invention or creation of political economy. And here I would suggest, again, that the Americans adopt something that they don't invent. They live it. And let me see if I can explain it both ways. The adopter is actually not English, but I believe Scottish. His name's Adam Smith. And in Glasgow, he publishes two great books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759 and An Inquiry Concerning the Wealth of Nations in 1776. And that's just the point. The very year the Americans undertake the revolution, Adam Smith publishes a giant volume, right? I don't make the students read this anymore, so I feel very bad about that. 1,350 pages, right? On an inquiry concerning the wealth of nations. And in this book, which we know for a fact Americans didn't read. How do we know that? Well, he publishes it the same year as the revolution, so they couldn't have read it yet. But what he has in 1,300 plus pages is in fact exactly what the colonists, now revolutionaries, are arguing against the British Empire, against the tea, against the stamps, against the molasses, against all the various acts that Parliament's passing. It hurts the empire when it hurts us. It helps the empire when you let us go. Laissez-faire. He, in the Wealth of Nations, says the way to get ahead is to leave people alone. Less government, less regulation. He might not argue the same thing, by the way, in the 21st century, by the way, but he certainly argues this in the 18th century. That is, we're not facing a zero-sum game. If Bostonians and Philadelphians and Virginians, etc., get rich, it won't hurt the empire. In fact, it'll help the empire. Indeed, even if people in Paris and Madrid or Moscow and Stockholm get rich, even if these empires flourish, doesn't mean the English will fail. Indeed, empires might all grow wealthy at the same time. What a great notion. The Americans do not write this. They do not read it yet. Maybe they don't read it at all. I remember I was assigned this when I was an 18-year-old, and I'm not sure how much of it I read. I'm not sure I got past the pin factory, which is the first 20 pages of the book. Anyway, you don't read it until you assign it. That's one of the things you learn as a professor. Then you have to get to it. In any event, Americans didn't write it. They didn't read it at the time, but they were living it. This was precisely their argument. Do not regulate us. Do not tell us in London how best to operate an economy. The invisible hand of capitalism will do that for you. So the Americans take moral consequentialism, they take political economy, and they do the next step. They take the nature of humans and say, now we can do a science of politics. So with ethics, with economy, we can now look at politics. And their declaring independence, in many ways, is the first expression of this desire and this confidence to scientifically say who should rule whom and how. This would have been, indeed, a great thing to lose. So when in the course of human events, yes, you may not know this very well, but this is the preamble to the Declaration of Independence passed in Congress on the 4th of July, 1776. And I want to suggest a few things about this, right? So the first one is the notion that the Americans are talking when in the course of human events, that they are basically understand themselves to be what? Impelled to do something. The Americans are what we might call, I have this next, reluctant revolutionaries. And why not? If we go all the way back to those portraits I had of James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington a little earlier, you know what we find? Virtually every one of them is wealthy. The poorest by far would be Alexander Hamilton, a bastard child who does extremely well, but isn't rich. But George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they owned huge plantations in Virginia. They were very rich indeed. So revolutionaries, yes. But what kind of revolutionaries? Certainly reluctant ones because they had so much to lose. The real revolutionary should have been what? Well, maybe Thomas Jefferson's 300 slaves, right? They would have had something to gain, right? So these folks were very worried and very nervous. So what they give us, alas, doesn't appeal very much to 18-year-olds. I don't see very many 18-year-olds in this audience. But what they give us is very much a reluctant, prudential, careful revolution. Is that oxymoronic to you? Maybe it is. But this is what they thought they were doing. Secondly, they very much were wedded to the idea that they were, if in any way better than their British former masters, would-be masters, parents in the parent-child colonial relationship, if the children had more insight than the parents, it was because they were not fooled. They didn't have tradition. They didn't have history that was blinding them, that was coloring the glasses through which they looked at the world. And seeing the world more naturally, they saw natural law. They saw the rules of the marketplace. They saw the rules of nature. They saw the natural equality of mankind in perhaps a unique way, perhaps a way for the first time in history. And this is what they tried to express in their declaration. So they looked to nature, and nature is God. And what they found were rules and laws of human nature. It's also interesting that they said that when people decide to dissolve the bands, again, very prudential, right? They're not here at war. They're just dissolving the bands. They say this, which is very interesting. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare their causes which impel them. What does that mean? How do we read this? What kind of people think it's important to have a decent respect for the opinions of mankind? Well, I'll give you two answers to this. The flippant answer is very easy, which is these are paranoid people. That is, these are people who are so obsessed with themselves that they can't just have a revolution and say, you know, whatever, you know, to the empire. They actually have to tell them, not only are we having a revolution, but we have to explain to you why we're right. Right? Right? And not only are we leaving, but clearly it's your fault. Right? And so a decent opinion in respect of mankind may just be, well, we really feel guilty. We really feel nervous about what we're doing, so we better, right, come up with good excuse or excuses. And indeed, many historians read the revolution and the revolutionary rhetoric as exactly that, right? Ideological window dressing behind which there are other motives. Maybe I'll get a question or two on that if we have time. The more generous way of looking at it is, in fact, that these people are enlightened. That these are writers. They are obsessed, not with writing huge tomes, but with writing essays, little documents, common sense, pamphlets. and that they are, in fact, as enlightened, literate folk in a literate world, or an increasingly literate world, obsessed with something that we think is horrible, ideology, but which I would rather call something very positive. They tried to connect all the dots. They tried to make their ideas make sense. Their theory of nature, their theory of humans, their theory of politics had to go together. It had to be cogent and rational and explainable. And if they couldn't explain it to mankind, then they might well be, and probably were, wrong. All right, so what do they explain? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Well, this is an interesting question, self-evident truths. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I can't explain this. I've tried many times. I can't explain it to you. The best I can suggest is this. There are other truths which are not self-evident. So what do we do with those? You go to math class, right? You actually work them out. You actually spend time in a lab or puzzling through it or gaining evidence. That is, you demonstrate something. So self-evident truths are all the other things. That's all the things that are true, and they're true because we are declaring them so. We take them as primitives, fundamental things that we feel by their nature do not demand proof. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, I want to add two more small things before we move on here. How am I doing for time? We probably want a half hour for questions, so I'll take about 10 more minutes here. And that is that in this document that virtually every American reads, and in literally hundreds, maybe thousands of places tomorrow throughout the United States, they will take it out, and they will even practice reading it, often aloud. And it is a document that's meant to be read aloud. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I would bet in every instance, probably rightly so, that means I'm wrong, they'll go past the verb. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Maybe they'll get to, what? All men, and denigrate that. Talk about equality. They'll move on to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But they'll pass the verb because it's such an insignificant verb. We hold these truths. But in my mind, or to my mind, if I have one, in my opinion, that's perhaps the most revealing word in the entire document. This is the word that tells us what the Americans are really like and what they thought made them genuine children of the Enlightenment. Not we declare, not we know, not it is definitive. We hold. We hold these truths. We're setting them out before you. These are the ones that we're going to go with. We hold these truths. We're going to go with this. We're going to set up a government and a society based on these. But are they true? Are they right? Is it knowledge? Is it fact? Is it absolute? Is it God's view? No, it's not. It is not. These folks are setting up a government and a society explicitly acknowledging the limitations of humans, or at least what we might call the epistemological limits of humans. You don't like that word? I don't either. That basically, how do you know stuff, right? That's what epistemology is, the knowing of knowing. How do you know stuff? And what these enlightened, revolutionary Americans are saying is, if we are truly revolutionary, it's because we are not saying we know. God knows, and we're not God. So we merely hold these truths to be self-evident. Is this an American innovation? No, I don't think it is. The Americans are children of a European Enlightenment. But if the Americans hadn't declared their independence, perhaps we would never have had this kind of expression, this explicit attempt to set up a government on principles and ideals which Americans claim to be exactly that. Principles, ideas, ideals. But they're not absolute. They're not absolutely right. They're just a matter of beliefs. Very, very modest indeed. I know we don't associate American and modest. Modest American. Doesn't often go very well together, but that is precisely the argument I'm making. It may seem, in this case, counterintuitive to you, but that's precisely the claim I'm making. That's right. That these founders, prudent, enlightened, modest, at least when it came to their their basic claims about what you can know, especially, funny enough, in the science of politics. Okay, so finally, we can conclude on, there's 2 more slides, I think. We can conclude here on one other interesting note. The note that, in fact, one could have an entire what-if course on. No, not George Washington crossing the Delaware here, but on what this picture in many ways represents, or painting, sorry. This painting was painted in 1851 by a German named Lotze, right? Not an American, but obviously here what? He's trying to tell us what the world would miss, or would have missed, if the Americans had not declared their independence. It's also convenient for me, being a New Yorker, that I got to look at this painting anytime I went into the Metropolitan Museum of Art and into the American wing. And it is bigger than this reproduction. It's bigger than this whole screen. And it's one of the few rooms in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And by the way, you don't have to pay when you go to the Met. They ask you to give like $25, but look, it says, or whatever you want. So just walk by them. Say, hey, I'm a New Zealander. You know, no nukes and no pay, right? I have a theory about the no nukes, but I think that would be close to sacrilege. And what if your professor got fired, right? But one of the wonderful things is it's open, not on Mondays, I guess, but oh, it is now. There you go. I haven't been there yet.
Is it this Monday?
I urge you to go.
You go.
But I do lament, as Rafi and a few other students here, that you don't get to go to museums. If you get to live where there are art museums and you go all the time, you can just look at one thing. You just go in, you get 20 minutes. You look at one thing and everything, but there were seats in this hall, right, Helen? You've done it. There's seats, so you just sit there and you can sit and look at it. And if you look at this, you'll find that this is actually a representation in here. These folks, it should be exactly 13 of them because they're 13, but Georgia actually didn't get into the revolution until a little late. So there are 12 individuals here. I'm trying to find an excuse for this. But if you look at them, you'll find all the different types, all the different groups, if not exactly all the colonies, the ethnic groups that go into the making of the United States. So what if the Americans hadn't declared their independence? In many ways, this romantic German is telling us what the Americans are a polyglot group of people who somehow take the risk of getting in a tiny little boat called the American Dream or United States or something like that in 1776 to take on a great empire, right? They're on their way, actually. This is just before, this is Christmas night on the way to Trenton here across the Delaware River. And there's George Washington, right? And he certainly knows what he's doing, right? He's a great leader. He's leading the way. What about the others? No, they're not all convinced. Some of them look very nervous and very worried, and maybe we should go back. But what do we have here? French and Scots, and I guess this would be a frontiersman with his leather outfit. We have gentry. We have all the different aspects and parts of social class and ethnicity, at least that this romantic German thought made up the United States. Maybe America never crosses. Maybe it never gets there. Maybe it never reaches its ideal, right? It does win its revolution. Maybe it never quite wins the war. Maybe America does become an empire. But at least in this moment, it shows that whether it gets there or not, there's some sort of hope here for this remarkable group that ultimately is what? Is the world. How do you know who's a Frenchman? They know. How do you know who's Russian? I speak Russian. I spent a lot of time in Russia. How do you know who's a Russian? They just do. They just do. Blood and soil or language or something. How do you know who's an American, right? Right? All of America's greatest things are English, right? Whether it's John Locke or Shakespeare or the King James Bible, right? So it can't be language. How do you know? It's wedded to an ideal. It's wedded to the notion that somehow you're an American when you put that jersey on that represents the United States, when you become wedded to, well, a declaration. Holding truths, prudence. So my modern representation of Lotze's painting is, of course, the American football team, or rugby team, or cricket team. I don't think they have a cricket team at the Olympics. Because if you look on the back of their jerseys, like New Zealand, there's every different nationality on the back of their jersey, right? They're not all Smiths. They're not all one thing or a Jomo or anything. They're a mixture of all of the world. So this is Lotze's ideal of what we would have lost if there hadn't been an American Revolution. Of course, we might have lost some other things too.